The first soldiers to die from the sound of their own footsteps didn't know what killed them. By the time the bullets arrived, the jungle had already done its quiet, efficient work of pointing them out. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. The year was 1942, and the Pacific was not a theater of war so much as a grinding machine with teeth made of humidity, rot, and the kind of darkness that swallowed flashlight beams whole. The Americans had taken Guadalcanal in blood and stubbornness, and now the fight was spreading across a chain of islands where the vegetation pressed against every path, every clearing, every improvised foxhole like something alive and hungry. The Australians arrived into this particular hell not as rescuers, but as replacements, fresh enough to be useful, green enough to be dangerous to themselves. They came with Lee Enfields, mosquito nets, and standard-issue leather boots that had been designed, tested, and approved somewhere in England by men who had never once set foot on a tropical leaf. The boots arrived in crates. The jungle arrived all at once. The boots were fine boots, solid construction, good ankle support, durable leather that held up in mud and wet grass and the English countryside where the British Army had spent centuries perfecting the art of marching without embarrassment. But the Pacific Islands were not the English countryside. They were something else entirely. A landscape built from layers of decomposed vegetation so dense and so dry in certain patches that stepping on them produced a sound not unlike crushing a handful of paper in your fist. Loud, crisp, carrying. The kind of sound that traveled through still air with a clarity that made jungle acoustics feel almost surgical in their precision. At night, in the dark, under canopies so thick that moonlight arrived only in thin, broken shafts, that sound was not just noise. It was information, delivered instantly and without distortion to anyone within earshot who knew exactly what to listen for. The Japanese knew. They had been fighting in these forests longer, and their scouts, small units of men trained specifically for close-range jungle engagement, had learned to read the soundscape the way a sailor reads the wind. A boot on dry leaves at 50 meters was not a footstep. It was a location, a direction, sometimes even a rough estimate of how many men were moving and at what pace. The Australian patrols learned this lesson fast, which is to say they learned it the way most battlefield lessons get taught. Someone stepped, and someone else died before the echo finished. The reports came back to the officers in the careful, flattened language of military writing. But strip that away, and the message underneath was blunt and unambiguous. The boots were killing men, not by failing, by working exactly as designed. They were simply the wrong object in the wrong place, and the jungle had no patience whatsoever for that kind of mismatch. The first weeks were a catalogue of small disasters. A reconnaissance squad moving south along a ridgeline, trying to stay quiet, trying to stay alive, and failing at both because the leaf litter beneath them was bone dry and impossibly loud. 2 men from that squad never made it back to the staging area. A night patrol sent to observe a Japanese supply point along the coast. 6 soldiers, experienced, careful, moving single file through undergrowth so thick it felt like pushing through wet cloth. They made it within 200 yards of the target before a dry patch of ground betrayed them completely. The return fire was immediate and precise. 3 wounded, 1 dead. The mission scrapped before it had truly begun. The jungle, in its indifferent way, had done the enemy's reconnaissance for them, free of charge, delivered with every single step. Word spread through the battalion the way bad news always does in close quarters, not through briefings or official channels, but through mess tins and cigarette smoke, and the particular silence that falls over a group of men when someone mentions a name that everyone already recognizes as belonging to the dead. The officers wrote their reports in the same careful shorthand they had been trained to use. The quartermasters noted the problem and had no solution to offer because the solution did not exist yet in any supply depot, any equipment catalogue, or any manual that had followed these men across the water. The boots remained standard issue, the leaves remained dry, and the war, indifferent to the inconvenience it was causing, continued to demand that men move through the forest at night, quietly or not at all. The jungle kept its own census. Every creature that moved through it left a trace. A broken twig, a displaced leaf, a subtle shift in the way insects sang or fell silent. The Japanese scouts understood this ledger intimately, and they moved through the undergrowth like men who had struck a deal with the forest itself. They wore lightweight canvas shoes, thin-soled and flexible, designed not to conquer the ground, but to negotiate with it. The Australians watched them do this from a distance, at first without interest, and then, after enough men had died stepping on the wrong patch of leaves, with something closer to hunger. It was not a single moment of revelation. That is the kind of story people like to tell afterward. The flash of insight, the eureka spoken in the dark. What actually happened was slower and messier and far less dramatic. It happened in the margins of combat, in the pauses between engagements, in the idle observations of men who had nothing to do but wait and watch, and try not to get killed while doing it. Some of them looked at the ground and saw nothing but ground. Others looked at the same ground and began, gradually, to notice patterns. The way certain stretches of forest floor stayed damp while others dried out completely. The way the local people who moved alongside the Allied forces crossed these dry patches as though they simply did not exist. The local people. That phrase covers a great deal of ground itself. Across the islands where the fighting was heaviest, indigenous communities had lived inside these forests for generations beyond counting. They knew the vegetation the way a carpenter knows wood, not just its surface, but its behavior, its reactions, its hidden properties. They knew which trees produced sap that stayed flexible in heat, which bark could be stripped and used for wrapping, which plants released oils that changed the texture of anything they touched. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It existed in hands and practice and the kind of casual, unasked expertise that outsiders tend to overlook entirely until the moment it becomes desperately useful. The first Australian soldiers to pay real attention were not, as a rule, the officers. Officers had other concerns: supply lines, coordinates, the endless negotiation between what a battle required and what the chain of command was willing to authorize. The men who noticed the locals moving silently were corporals, privates, the kind of soldiers who spent most of their time close to the ground and far from briefing maps. One of them, attached to a unit operating on the northern coast of one of the larger islands, watched a local guide cross a stretch of dry leaf litter so completely devoid of sound that for a moment he questioned whether the man had actually moved at all. The guide's feet touched the ground, and the ground said nothing back. It was, to the soldier watching, deeply unsettling. He asked. This was not, in itself, unusual. The language barrier between the Australian soldiers and the local populations was significant but not total, and communication happened constantly, in fragments, through gesture and demonstration and the universal shorthand of pointing at things. What was unusual was that he asked the right question. Not quote zero, too broad, too vague, the kind of question that gets a polite shrug in response. He asked about the ground itself. What was on it? What was under it? Whether anything in the forest could change the way it felt when you stepped on it. The guide considered this for a long time, longer than the soldier expected, and then he walked into the tree line and did not come back for nearly an hour. When he returned, he was carrying two things: a small gourd sealed with a leaf, and a strip of bark that smelled faintly of resin. The contents of the gourd were a dark, slightly viscous liquid, tree sap, though not from any species the soldier could have identified on his own. The guide demonstrated something. He took a dry leaf from the ground, one of the very leaves that had been betraying the patrols for weeks, and he pressed it between his fingers after coating them with the sap. The leaf did not crunch. It bent. It folded silently, like wet cloth, like something that had forgotten how to be brittle. The soldier watched this happen twice, 3 times, and then he looked down at his boots, and something shifted in the way he was thinking about the problem entirely. It was not yet a solution. It was closer to a question that had finally found the shape it needed to be asked in. The corporal's name was not recorded in any document that survived the war. This is not unusual. The Pacific campaigns generated enormous quantities of paperwork: requisition forms, casualty reports, patrol logs written in pencil that the humidity slowly erased. But most of what mattered between individual men never made it onto paper at all. What is known is that he was attached to a unit operating out of a forward staging area, that he spent considerable time in direct contact with local guides, and that sometime in the late months of 1942 he began conducting what could only be called experiments, though he would never have used that word himself. He would have called it tinkering, or maybe just trying not to die. The first attempts were failures of a very specific kind. The sap worked on leaves. That much had been demonstrated clearly enough in the guide's casual little performance beneath the canopy. But leaves and boot leather are different materials, with different surfaces, different textures, different ways of absorbing or rejecting anything that is applied to them. The corporal tried coating the soles directly. The sap pooled in the creases of the leather, dried unevenly, and produced a surface that was sticky in some places and completely unchanged in others. He tried thinning it with water. The result was something that smelled vaguely unpleasant and did almost nothing at all. He tried applying it to the uppers instead of the soles, on the theory that flexibility mattered more than grip. The boots became stiff. They cracked along the seams after 2 days of wear, and one pair split open entirely during a morning patrol, leaving the man wearing them barefoot and furious on a stretch of trail that was, predictably, covered in thorns. None of this discouraged him, which says something about either his character or his stubbornness, or possibly about the fact that the alternative to tinkering with boots was sitting in a foxhole waiting for the next patrol to go wrong. He went back to the guide. This time the conversation, if conversation is the right word for an exchange conducted mostly through demonstration and the occasional shared cigarette, lasted longer. The guide showed him something new. Not a different sap, but a different method of application. The liquid needed to be worked into the leather slowly, over time, using friction and pressure rather than simply being poured or brushed on. The guide took a strip of leather. The corporal had brought one, torn from a broken strap, and worked the sap into it by hand, rubbing it between his palms, folding the leather, rubbing again. The process took the better part of an afternoon. When it was finished, the leather had changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but the corporal could feel it when he bent the strip between his fingers. Something in the material had shifted. It was quieter against itself. It yielded differently. The word quote one is important here, because what the sap was doing was not hardening the leather or coating it with a new layer of material. It was changing how the leather interacted with dry surfaces, making it more compliant, more willing to conform to irregular ground rather than landing flat and stiff and loud. The mechanism was not something anyone at the time understood in chemical terms, and the corporal certainly did not think about it that way. He thought about it the way a soldier thinks about anything that might keep him alive. Does it work? And can I do it again? The answer to both questions, after that long afternoon with the guide and the strip of leather, was cautiously yes. But cautiously was not the same as certainly. And there was a significant gap between treating a single strip of scrap leather and treating the boots that a man actually needed to walk in, fight in, and survive in. The other soldiers in the unit noticed what he was doing. Word travels fast in small groups living in close proximity, particularly when someone is doing something strange and visible and potentially useful. A private from Queensland, a wiry man in his mid-20s, who had a reputation for asking questions that made his superiors uncomfortable, watched the corporal work the sap into a boot sole one evening and sat down next to him without being invited. He did not ask what it was for. He already knew. Everyone in earshot knew, by now, that the boots were the problem, and that the corporal was trying to make them into something other than what they were. What the private asked instead was practical. How much sap did it take? How long did the treatment last before it wore off? Whether the boots would still hold together after being worked like that, or whether they would fall apart the way the first experimental pair had done. These were not idle questions. They were the questions of a man who was already thinking about doing the same thing to his own kit, and calculating whether the risk was worth the trouble. The corporal did not have answers to all of them yet. The treatment was new, the results were preliminary, and the boots he had worked on had not yet been tested on actual ground during an actual patrol. But something had changed in the way the problem was being discussed. It was no longer a single man's fixation. It had become, quietly and without any official sanction, a conversation. And conversations, once they start in a place like that, in conditions like those, have a way of moving faster than any order ever could. The sap came from a specific tree. This detail mattered more than anyone realized at first, because the Pacific Islands were not a uniform green carpet, but a patchwork of microclimates, soil types, and vegetation zones that changed dramatically from one valley to the next. Not every tree produced sap that worked. Not every sap that looked the same behaved the same way when rubbed into leather. The corporal learned this through failure. A batch of sap collected from a tree that looked nearly identical to the right one produced something that dried brittle and flaked off within hours, leaving the boots worse off than they had been before. The guide, when consulted, made a distinction that seemed obvious only in retrospect. The tree had to be a particular species, and it had to be tapped at a particular time of day, when the flow was slow and the liquid carried a different consistency than the watery flood that came in the early morning hours. This meant that gathering the sap was not a simple errand. It required knowing where the right trees grew, which parts of the island they favored, and how to tap them without killing the flow or alerting the local ecosystem to the intrusion in ways that might draw attention. The corporal began making side trips during patrols, not officially sanctioned, not logged in any patrol report with any accuracy. He would disappear into the undergrowth for 20 or 30 minutes, return with a gourd or a canteen half full of dark liquid, and say nothing about where he had been. His sergeant noticed. The sergeant said nothing either, which, in the particular culture of the units operating in the Pacific at that time, was itself a kind of permission. There were worse things a man could do during a war than wander off and collect tree sap. Some of those worse things were happening every single day. The first boots that were treated properly, sap from the right tree, applied with the right method, worked in over the course of a full day, belonged to a private named Dunlop. Whether this was his actual surname or a nickname derived from the tire brand that was everywhere in wartime Australia is a question nobody alive can answer with certainty. But the name stuck, and so did the boots. Dunlop wore them on a routine patrol 2 days after the treatment was finished, moving through a section of forest floor that was almost entirely dry leaf litter, the worst possible terrain, the kind of ground that had ended patrols before. He moved. The ground did not respond. Not with silence, exactly. There was still some sound, a faint compression, a whisper of contact. But compared to what the untreated boots produced on the same surface, it was as though someone had turned down the volume on the war by several degrees. Dunlop himself described it later as walking on something that was not quite there. The other men in the patrol noticed immediately. This was not the kind of thing you could miss, not when you had spent weeks listening to your own footsteps announce your position to every enemy scout within range. 2 of them asked Dunlop afterward what he had done differently. He told them. The telling was not complicated. Sap, leather, patience, the right tree. But the doing was harder than the telling suggested, and everyone understood this without having to say it out loud. By the end of that week, 3 more pairs of boots were being treated. By the end of the following week, the number had doubled. The process was slow because the sap had to be worked in carefully and the leather had to dry properly before the boots could be worn. But it was happening, and it was happening entirely outside any official awareness of the situation. The officers did not know. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the chain of command in the Pacific campaigns was neither as rigid nor as attentive as it might appear in the histories written afterward. Men were dying in ways that made perfect tactical sense on paper. Ambushes, firefights, the ordinary grinding attrition of jungle warfare. And the idea that some of those deaths might be preventable through an unauthorized modification to standard issue footwear was not the kind of thing that floated upward through the ranks on its own. The reports said what they said. The boots were standard issue. The patrols were conducted according to protocol. The losses were regrettable, but within expected parameters. Nobody was asking whether the boots themselves were the variable that needed changing. because nobody at the level where such questions got asked had ever thought to ask them. Meanwhile, down at ground level, in the mud and the insects and the particular exhaustion that comes from living in a war zone where the enemy is not the only thing trying to kill you, something was taking shape. It did not have a name yet. It did not have a procedure or a supply chain or any of the apparatus that would eventually be needed to make it work at scale. What it had was about a dozen pairs of boots and the quiet, shared understanding among the men who wore them that they had stumbled onto something that mattered. The uncertainty, though, had not disappeared. The treatment worked on dry leaves, that much was established. But the patrols were about to move into terrain that was different in ways nobody had yet tested, and the sap's behavior on surfaces other than leaf litter remained, as of that point, entirely unknown. The news reached a lieutenant before it reached anyone with the authority to do anything about it. His name was Harrington, and he was not, by any account, a man who enjoyed surprises. He ran his section with a quiet competence that his men respected without particularly liking. The kind of officer who remembered every detail of every patrol report and noticed, eventually, when the details stopped adding up. What he noticed first was not the boots themselves, but the sap. A faint smell, resinous and slightly sweet, drifting off the feet of men who stood in his briefing area one morning. He asked about it. The answers he received were evasive in the way that answers from soldiers always are when the thing being asked about is unofficial and potentially useful. Harrington pressed. Within the hour, he knew everything. His first reaction was not anger, which surprised the men who told him. It was not enthusiasm either. It was something closer to irritation, the irritation of a man who prided himself on knowing what was happening in his section and had, for some period of time that he could not precisely calculate, failed to do so. He asked to see the boots. He examined them closely, running his fingers along the treated soles, bending the leather, holding them up to the available light as though they might reveal something about themselves if looked at from the right angle. Then he put them down and spent the rest of that day doing something that Harrington was known for doing well. He thought about the problem from multiple angles before committing to a single one. The problem, as Harrington saw it, was not whether the treatment worked. The men who had used it were alive, and some of them had moved through terrain that should have killed them. The problem was everything around the treatment, the lack of standardization, the dependence on a single source of knowledge that existed only in the informal relationship between the corporal and the local guide. The absence of any documented method that could be replicated reliably by someone who had not been present for the original demonstrations. If the sap came from the wrong tree or was applied incorrectly, the boots would fail. If the guide was unavailable, captured, wounded, simply unwilling to continue sharing knowledge with foreign soldiers fighting a war that was not his, the entire process would collapse. Harrington understood, with the clarity of a man who had seen supply chains fail in the Pacific, that anything built on a single point of vulnerability was not a solution. It was a gamble. He did not shut it down. This was the decision that mattered, and it was not an obvious one. Unauthorized modifications to equipment were, technically, a breach of protocol. The boots were Crown property, issued for a specific purpose, and altering them without permission was the kind of thing that could, in a different set of circumstances, result in a formal reprimand or worse. But Harrington was a pragmatist, and pragmatists in wartime learn quickly that the rules were written for a world that no longer exists. Instead of shutting it down, he did something more complicated. He asked the corporal to teach him. Not just the method, the thinking behind it. Why certain trees and not others? Why the sap had to be applied slowly? What happened when it was applied to surfaces other than leaf litter, and what the results of those experiments had been so far? The corporal, who had expected either punishment or indifference, was caught off guard by the specificity of the questions. He answered as best he could, which was not always completely, because some of what he knew he had learned through instinct rather than observation, and instinct is difficult to explain to someone who is listening with a notebook. The notebook was important. Harrington wrote things down. He wrote down the name of the tree, or rather, the description of it, since the local name meant nothing to anyone in the unit, and the botanical identification would not come until much later, if it came at all. He wrote down the method of application, the approximate ratio of sap to surface area, the drying time, the estimated duration of effectiveness before the treatment began to wear off. He wrote down the failures as well as the successes, because failures, in his experience, were more instructive than victories when it came to understanding why something worked. By the end of 2 days, he had filled several pages with notes that constituted, for the first time, something approaching a documented procedure. It was rough, it was incomplete, but it existed on paper, which meant it could survive beyond the men who had created it. What Harrington did not write down, what he could not have written down because it had not yet happened, was the question that was already forming at the back of his mind as he reviewed his notes that evening. The treatment had been tested on foot patrols moving through dry forest floor. It had worked, but the war was not going to stay in dry forests. The fighting was moving, shifting, expanding into new terrain and new conditions, and the sap had not been tested against any of them. Mud, for instance. Sand. The wet, compressed earth of riverbanks where patrols crossed at night. What happened to the treatment in those conditions was not something anyone knew yet, and the fact that it remained unknown felt, to Harrington at least, less like a gap in knowledge and more like a door that had not yet been opened, with something on the other side that might change everything, or might ruin it entirely. The patrol was scheduled for the night of the 14th. 7 men, moving northeast along a ridge that descended toward a Japanese observation post the intelligence officers had identified 3 days prior. The mission was simple on paper. Get close enough to confirm the post's exact position, note the number of personnel, report back before dawn. No engagement. No firefight. The kind of operation that lived or died entirely on whether the men conducting it could move without being heard. 4 of the 7 were wearing treated boots. The other 3 were not, and this discrepancy was not accidental. It was deliberate. Harrington had arranged it that way. The reasoning was straightforward, though it required a particular kind of coldness to execute. If the treated boots worked as intended, the difference between the 4 men wearing them and the 3 who were not would be audible, not just to the men themselves, but to anyone listening from a distance. Harrington wanted to know exactly how audible. He wanted data, not impression. Not the subjective assessment of soldiers who were tired and frightened and inclined to believe in anything that might improve their chances. He wanted the patrol to walk across dry ground in formation, treated boots alongside untreated ones, and he wanted someone in the group to pay attention to the difference. That someone was a corporal named Briggs, a man with an unusually acute sense of hearing who had survived 2 ambushes by virtue of noticing sounds that other men had filtered out. Briggs was not wearing treated boots. He was there to listen. They entered the forest at 2200 hours. The canopy closed above them almost immediately, swallowing what little light remained and replacing it with a darkness so complete that each man could see nothing but the vague outline of the back of the man in front of him. They moved in single file, spaced far enough apart that a single burst of fire would not take more than 1 or 2 of them, close enough that they could maintain contact through touch, a hand on a shoulder, a tug on a sleeve. The ground beneath them was exactly what Harrington had been told it would be. Dry, dense with fallen leaves, the kind of surface that had betrayed patrols before. The first 50 yards passed in near silence. Then one of the untreated boots came down on a particularly brittle stretch of litter, and the sound carried forward through the dark like a crack of a branch dropped from a height. Briggs heard it. Everyone heard it. But what Briggs registered with the particular precision that made him valuable in exactly this kind of situation was the contrast. The treated boots landing on the same surface produced something that was not quite silence, but was close enough to it that his ear had to strain to register the contact at all. A faint compression, a slight give, the sound of something that was yielding rather than breaking. The untreated boots, by comparison, announced themselves with every step. The difference was not subtle. It was not the kind of thing you had to be told to notice. It was the difference between a door that closed quietly and a door that slammed, and it was audible to anyone within range who happened to be listening. Briggs kept moving, kept listening, and said nothing. He would say everything later, in the debrief, in words that Harrington would write down in his notebook, with a care that suggested he understood exactly what he was recording. The patrol reached the observation post at approximately 0100. They did what they had come to do, confirmed the position, counted the personnel visible from their vantage point, noted the equipment and the lines of sight and the gaps in the perimeter that a more aggressive operation might exploit. Then they withdrew the same way they had come, retracing their steps through the dark and the dry leaves and the silence that the treated boots were making possible. The withdrawal took longer than the approach, because moving away from an enemy position required even more care than moving toward one. The temptation to hurry, to get away, to put distance between yourself and the thing that could kill you was almost physical, and it had to be resisted step by step. But they made it. All 7 of them made it back to the staging area before dawn, undetected, undiscovered, alive. The debrief was held the following morning, in the flat, overcast light that passed for sunrise on the islands. Briggs gave his account. The other men in the patrol gave theirs. The consensus was unanimous and unqualified. The treated boots had performed exactly as hoped, and the untreated boots had performed exactly as feared. Harrington listened, asked his questions, wrote his notes. Then he closed the notebook and sat for a while without speaking, which was something his men had learned to recognize as a sign that he was thinking about something beyond the immediate situation. What he was thinking about, though he did not share it with anyone present, was scale. 7 men were not an answer. They were a proof of concept, and proof of concept was a very different thing from a solution that could be applied across an entire battalion, an entire campaign, an entire theatre of war where the supply of the right tree sap was finite and the demand for quiet footsteps was not. The information did not travel through official channels. There was no memo, no circular, no directive issued from any desk that bore the stamp of authority. What happened instead was something far older and far more reliable than paperwork. Men talked. A sergeant from one unit visited a forward supply depot to collect ammunition and came back with a question he had not arrived with. A lieutenant at another staging area overheard 2 privates arguing about whether boot leather could actually absorb tree sap without rotting, and instead of dismissing the conversation as the kind of idle nonsense that soldiers generated to fill the hours between engagements, he listened. Within 2 weeks of the successful patrol, the treatment had become a topic of discussion across at least 4 separate units operating in the same general theater. Within a month, it had spread further still, carried by the same invisible network of rumor and demonstration that had always been the true nervous system of any army in the field. The spreading was not uniform. Some units took to it immediately, driven by officers like Harrington, who understood the value of what was being offered and had the practical intelligence to act on it without waiting for permission from above. Others were skeptical, or worse, indifferent, the kind of indifference that came from having survived this long without the treatment and seeing no compelling reason to change what was working well enough. A few officers actively discouraged it, not out of any principled objection, but out of a vague unease about men modifying their own equipment without authorization. The war was full of such unease, and it was rarely worth fighting, because the men who needed the treatment most were the men who were dying without it, and they did not have the luxury of waiting for institutional comfort to catch up with battlefield reality. The practical bottleneck was the sap itself. Harrington's notes described the process clearly enough that anyone with a pair of hands in an afternoon could treat a pair of boots. But the sap had to come from somewhere, and the somewhere was a specific tree growing in specific locations on specific islands, and those locations were not always accessible, not always safe, and not always near the units that needed them most. A small informal supply network began to take shape. Men who knew where the trees grew, men who could tap them without drawing attention, men who carried the filled gourds from one unit to another during the normal movements of troops and supplies that the war demanded anyway. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily fragile system. A single disruption, a shift in the front line, a Japanese advance that cut off access to a particular grove of trees, could have stopped the whole thing cold. It did not stop, partly because the war continued to move in directions that kept the supply lines open, and partly because the men involved in maintaining them understood, without anyone having to explain it, that what they were passing along was not just a technique for treating boots. It was a way of staying alive in a landscape that was trying, with considerable efficiency, to get them killed. That understanding gave the informal network a resilience that no official supply chain could have matched. The men who carried the sap did so with the same quiet seriousness that they carried ammunition. Not because someone had ordered them to, but because the alternative was watching their comrades die from a problem they knew how to solve. The sap moved. The boots got treated. The patrols went out at night and came back in the morning, and the jungle, for once, did not betray them. But the treatment was changing, not in the way it was applied. Harrington's method remained essentially the same, and the men who followed it did so with a consistency that spoke to its simplicity. What was changing was the way people understood what it did and why. The original explanation, that the sap made the leather quieter against dry leaves, was accurate as far as it went, but it did not go far enough. Men who had used the treated boots on different surfaces began reporting results that did not fit neatly into the original model. On certain kinds of sand, the boots were no quieter than they had been before. On damp ground near river crossings, the treatment seemed to make them slightly stickier, which was useful in some situations and dangerous in others. On the dry, packed earth of certain trails, the effect was somewhere in between, reduced noise but not eliminated entirely. The treatment worked, but it worked differently depending on what it was working against, and nobody had yet mapped those differences with any precision. This mattered more than it might appear to, because the war was not going to hold still and wait for the map to be completed. The fighting was expanding, the terrain was changing, and the men who relied on silent boots to keep them alive were moving into environments where the treatment's effectiveness was genuinely uncertain. A patrol commander who trusted his boots to be quiet on leaf litter and then found himself crossing a stretch of dry sand in the dark was operating on assumptions that might, at that particular moment, be entirely wrong. The gap between what the treatment could do and what the men needed it to do was narrowing in some places and widening in others, and the question of which way it would settle, whether the sap would prove adaptable enough to serve the war as it actually was, rather than the war as it had been when the treatment was first devised, remained, as of that point, genuinely open. The Japanese noticed the silence before they understood its source. This is how such things tend to register in war, not as a clearly identified threat, but as an absence, a gap in the pattern of information that the senses have learnt to rely on. The scouts who operated along the northern perimeters of the contested islands were men of considerable skill, trained to read the forest the way a tracker reads animal trails, and they had built their entire operational model around the assumption that enemy movement at night would produce sound. It always had. The Australian boots on dry ground had been, for months, a reliable and consistent source of acoustic information. When that information began to arrive less frequently, and then less reliably, the scouts did not immediately conclude that something had changed about the boots. They concluded, first, that the Australians had changed their routes. The route theory held for approximately 2 weeks. During that period, Japanese patrol commanders adjusted their positions, shifted their listening posts, and sent additional scouts to cover the areas where Australian movement had previously been detected with such regularity. The scouts found nothing, or almost nothing. Occasional footsteps, faint and irregular, that did not match the patterns they had learned to expect. The absence of the familiar sound was, in its own way, more unsettling than any sound could have been. A soldier who hears the enemy approaching can prepare. A soldier who hears nothing can only wait. And waiting in the dark for something that might or might not be coming is a particular kind of torment that erodes judgment faster than almost any other experience of war. The first confirmed incident that forced the Japanese to reconsider their assumptions occurred during a night raid on a supply depot located on the southwestern edge of one of the larger islands. An Australian unit, moving in near silence through a stretch of forest that the Japanese garrison had considered secure, reached the depot's outer perimeter without triggering any alarm. The attack itself was brief and violent, the kind of operation that was over before the defenders had fully processed what was happening. But what the Japanese commanders focused on afterward was not the attack itself, but the approach. Their sentries had heard nothing. Their tripwire alarms, strung between trees at ground level along the most likely approach routes, had not been triggered. The Australians had found gaps, or had moved through them with a care that suggested they knew exactly where the wires were. The silence of the approach was, to the garrison commander writing his report afterward, more troubling than the damage the raid had caused. The Japanese response was measured but immediate. Additional sentries were posted. Listening disciplines were tightened. Orders were issued to increase the frequency of perimeter checks, particularly during the hours before dawn when the raids had been occurring most often. None of these measures addressed the actual problem, which was that the enemy had found a way to move through the forest without producing the sounds that the entire defensive posture had been built to detect. The Japanese military, like any military confronting an unexpected development in the field, responded first with the tools it already had, because those tools were familiar, and the alternative, acknowledging that the tools were no longer sufficient, required a kind of institutional honesty that wartime command structures were not, as a rule, well suited to provide. Word of the changed Australian movement patterns reached Japanese intelligence officers operating at a level above the individual garrison commanders. The analysis that followed was careful and, given the information available at the time, not unreasonable. The leading theory was that the Australians had adopted new footwear, canvas shoes or something similar, imported from another source or manufactured locally. This theory was plausible enough to be acted upon, and for a period of several weeks, Japanese scouts were specifically instructed to look for evidence of changed boot types among captured or killed Australian soldiers. They found standard-issue leather boots, indistinguishable from the ones the Australians had always worn. The boots looked the same. They were the same boots. What had changed about them was invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for, and nobody on the Japanese side at that point knew. The intelligence gap was significant, and it deepened as the weeks passed. The Japanese military was, in many respects, exceptionally well informed about the capabilities and equipment of the forces it was fighting. Its intelligence networks were sophisticated, its analysis was often sharp, and its scouts were among the most skilled jungle operators in any army then at war. But intelligence, like any system, has blind spots, and this was one of them. The modification to the boots was too small, too informal, and too far below the level of official military procurement to appear in any of the channels through which Japanese intelligence gathered its information. It was not a new weapon. It was not a new vehicle or a new tactic in any conventional sense. It was a change in the relationship between a boot and a leaf, and it had been made by ordinary soldiers using knowledge borrowed from people the war had rendered almost invisible. The Japanese were looking for something large and identifiable. What they were facing was something quiet, and quiet things, by their very nature, are difficult to find. The sap took its toll on the men who used it. This was not something that appeared in any report, because the cost was not the kind that military medicine recognized or tracked. There were no forms for it, no checkbox on a casualty assessment that said skin irritation from unauthorized boot treatment, or cracking of the hands from prolonged contact with tree resin. The damage was quiet and cumulative, the way most damage in the Pacific was. Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, accumulating in the body the way moisture accumulated in everything else, until one day you looked at your hands and they were not the hands you had arrived with. The resin dried the skin. This was the first and most persistent complaint, though complaint is too strong a word for what it actually was. More of an observation, noted and then set aside, because the men who were treating boots had long since stopped expecting their bodies to remain undamaged. The corporal who had started the whole process noticed it first, a tightness in his palms after a day of working the sap into leather, a dryness that did not respond to water or to the small amounts of oil that were available in the kit. Over days, the skin began to crack, particularly along the lines of the fingers and across the knuckles. The cracks were shallow at first, then deeper, and they stung in the particular way that open skin stings when it comes into contact with salt, which, in the Pacific, was everywhere, in the sweat and the air and the water that was never quite fresh enough to drink without tasting the sea in it. Other men reported similar effects, though the severity varied considerably depending on how much sap they handled and how long they spent working it into the leather. Some men developed a persistent redness across the backs of their hands that did not fade even after they stopped treating boots for several days. Others found that the smell of the resin clung to their skin in a way that no amount of washing could fully remove. A faint, sweet, slightly cloying odor that followed them into mess areas and sleeping quarters and became, for some, a source of quiet embarrassment. One man, a sergeant from a unit operating on the eastern coast of one of the larger islands, developed a rash that spread from his hands to his forearms and eventually to his chest, and was sent back to a field hospital where the doctors treated it as a tropical infection and prescribed rest. They did not ask what had caused it. He did not tell them. The physical cost was one thing. The psychological cost was subtler and harder to measure, but it was there, in the way that men who spent their nights moving silently through enemy-held territory began to think about their own bodies. The treated boots made them quieter, but they also made them more vulnerable in ways that were difficult to articulate. A man in standard boots who stepped on a dry leaf and made noise could, at least, react. Could freeze, could change direction, could take cover. A man in treated boots who made no noise at all received no warning from the ground. He moved through the dark in a silence that was not entirely natural, and the silence itself became a kind of isolation, a severance from the environmental feedback that the human body had always relied on to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Some men found this liberating. Others found it deeply unsettling, in a way that surfaced not during the patrols themselves, but afterward, in the small hours of the morning when sleep would not come, and the mind replayed the experience of moving through darkness without any of the sensory anchors it expected to find. Harrington recorded some of this in his notes, though not all of it. The physical effects he documented with the same precision he brought to everything: the skin irritation, the smell, the approximate timeline from first contact with the sap to the onset of symptoms. The psychological effects he noted more obliquely, in language that suggested he understood their significance without being entirely comfortable putting it into words. A phrase like, "Men report an altered sense of ground contact," or "Several soldiers have described the experience as disorienting after extended use," carried more weight than it might appear to, coming from an officer who was not given to imprecision. He was recording something real, something that the men were experiencing, and he was doing so in a way that acknowledged it without dramatizing it, because dramatization would have made it sound like a problem requiring a solution, and the solution, stop treating the boots, was not one that anyone was willing to accept. The war, as it always did, continued to demand more than the men could comfortably give. The raids were working, the patrols were succeeding. The treated boots were keeping soldiers alive who would, by all previous calculations, have been dead. The cost of that survival, the cracked skin, the fading sleep, the strange disconnection from the ground beneath their feet, was a cost that was being paid in the currency that soldiers had always paid in, quietly, without receipt, without anyone outside the immediate circle of men involved knowing that the transaction was taking place at all. The sap worked, the boots were silent, and somewhere in the gap between the silence and the skin, between the jungle and the leather, something was being spent that could not be replenished. And the men who were spending it were doing so with their eyes open, because the alternative was closing them. The war moved on, the way wars do, not in a single direction but in several at once, spreading and contracting like something breathing. The islands where the treated boots had first been tested became, within months, rear areas, places where the fighting had already passed through and left nothing behind but graves and the particular silence that follows destruction. The men who had worn the boots moved with the front, carried the knowledge with them, and in some cases carried the sap itself in battered containers that traveled from island to island in kit bags alongside ammunition and ration tins. The treatment did not disappear when the terrain changed. It adapted, imperfectly, the way everything in the Pacific adapted, not by design but by necessity, by the relentless pressure of men who needed to stay alive and were willing to tinker with anything that helped them do so. Harrington's notebook survived the war. Whether it was kept deliberately or simply never discarded is not something anyone can say with certainty. But it ended up, like a great deal of the informal documentation from the Pacific campaigns, in a box somewhere, in an archive that was not organized with any particular care for the material it contained. The notes are sparse in places, dense in others, written in a hand that grows less steady as the months progress. Not from injury, but from exhaustion, the kind that seeps into everything a man does when he has been living close to the ground for too long. The observations about the sap, the method, the effects on the men who used it, are all there. So are the questions that Harrington never answered, the gaps in the record that he left open, not because he forgot them, but because the war ended before he could fill them. The local guides who had shared the knowledge that made the treatment possible received no recognition. This was not an oversight in the usual sense. It was not that someone forgot to write their names down or failed to include them in a ceremony. It was that the structures through which recognition was given simply did not extend to people like them. They were not soldiers. They were not Allied personnel in any formal sense. They were men and women who had lived on these islands long before any war arrived, and who would continue to live on them long after it was over. And the knowledge they carried, about trees, about sap, about the quiet behavior of the forest, was theirs in a way that no military operation could claim or repay. The debt was real. It was simply never acknowledged, which is a different thing from not existing. The technique itself faded from active use as the Pacific Campaign entered its final phases. By 1945, the fighting had moved to larger islands where the terrain and the conditions were different enough that the boot treatment, while still occasionally useful, was no longer the decisive advantage it had been in the smaller, denser forests of the earlier engagements. The men who had relied on it moved into other kinds of warfare. Amphibious assaults, urban combat, the brutal, close-quarters fighting that characterized the final months of the war in the Pacific. And the boots they wore in those engagements were, once again, standard issue, untreated, loud on the ground in the way that boots had always been. The jungle that had demanded silence was behind them. What lay ahead made different demands entirely. After the war, the treatment was not formally adopted by any military organization. No manual was written. No standard operating procedure was issued. The reasons for this were multiple and overlapping. The post-war period was one of rapid demobilization, of institutional memory being shed like skin, of the particular kind of forgetting that happens when an army transitions from fighting to peacetime, and the lessons of combat are filed away in boxes that may or may not be opened again. The boot leather solution, as it came to be called in the few informal accounts that circulated among veterans in the years that followed, was too small, too unofficial, and too dependent on a specific set of conditions to survive the transition from war to peace. It belonged to a world that no longer existed, and the world that replaced it had no use for it. But it did not disappear entirely. In the decades that followed, in the quiet corners where veterans gathered and talked about the things that mattered and the things that did not, the story surfaced occasionally, told not as a tale of great heroism or decisive victory, but as something smaller and stranger. A group of men who noticed that their boots were killing them. A corporal who asked the right question of the right person at the right moment. A lieutenant who wrote things down. A sap that changed the way leather met the ground. The story had no single hero and no dramatic conclusion, and this was precisely what made it worth telling. It was not about courage in the grand sense. It was about attention, the slow, unglamorous, occasionally desperate act of paying close attention to the world immediately around you, and doing something with what you noticed. In the end, that was all it had ever been. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every subscription and every comment helps new stories like this one find the people they were meant for.